One of the workshops for the mathematics of energy systems. I want to particularly thank Stan, who I think was the main perpetrator.
Oh no,
Just one of. Oh, you're going to try to spread the blame, are you?
Yeah.
Okay. So, but this is going to be a perfectly glorious week, and thank you, Stan, for all your effort. And I also want to thank Andy, who championed this particular workshop together with Chris, Natalia, and myself, who sort of chipped in on the tasks as Andy found something useful for us to do that he was sure that we wouldn't mess up. I'd like to quickly introduce our first speaker, and then I believe Danny. Danny, are you here? I heard an from the back somewhere. Where is he? Raise his hand. Danny Ralph, who was, I think, supposed to be the nemesis, yes? Okay. We have for each speaker a nemesis, and the nemesis is allowed to ask one question, and if the question goes more than 10 minutes, I cut you off. So, seriously, the question should be a short one and allow the speaker to expand on some things. So first of all, an introduction for David. And David, I think your most important responsibility, is it not, is that you're the president of the senior combination room. I don't like to use the word president for obvious reasons, because I have a president where I'm embarrassed of on the other side of the pond. President, and the senior combination room is, the person there is responsible for the social activities, perhaps also for the wine cellar? No, he shakes his head. Sadly not. I'm sure the wine cellar would be upgraded if you were. At Churchill College, where he has been a fellow. So David has been a full professor in the Department of Applied Economics since 1988, where he was also chair for 15 years. He directs the Energy Policy Research Group at Cambridge, vice chair of the Cambridge Economic Policy Associates, and incidentally a commander of the Order of the British Empire and a fellow of the British Academy. And finally, as you will find out if you don't already know, a very entertaining and provocative speaker, the perfect person to start off this week. So, David.
Well, thank you, Ben, and thank you in particular to the people who organised this week. I'm looking forward to it. It's impressive just how many of the right people have been brought from farther parts of the earth. I don't know if
microphone.
you could fix me up with a microphone. That would probably be a good idea in case my voice fails.
It's on. Good, thank you. So I take my task as the warm-up act. I'm an economist. Most of you are probably serious applied mathematicians, electrical engineers, people who know how to design the mechanisms that we need to deliver what I'm going to tell you we need. And in particular, the Energy Policy Research Group is most concerned, as the name suggests, with trying to improve and design better policies. So what I want to do is give you some evidence of what the problems are that we need to address, tell you what economists view as the relevant principles to apply to the design of policy. Then I'll say what sort of policies we've actually been experiencing in this country in particular, and perhaps then how we could improve them. So in particular, I'm going to talk about the recent rapid expansion of renewables, renewable electricity supply. I'm going to talk about the electricity market reform that we enacted in 2013 and what the problems were that it was designed to address, and later on how well it managed to address those. There are some, I think, quite startling successes and some limitations. I see my nemesis has just walked in, as appropriate. And then I want to dig down a little bit more deeply into why it is that we want to support renewables. We have all these policies to support renewables, but we should step back and ask what actually is the underlying purpose, because that will guide how best to provide that support, which I will argue at the moment is not particularly well designed and has some rather perverse consequences. And then, and I hardly need to explain this to most people in the audience, electricity isn't just a single thing. We're interested not just in the energy, but in the capacity, the ability to deliver it, and the quality of that supply. And the distinctions between them suggest different ways of organizing their delivery and paying for them. And I'm going to talk a bit about capacity auctions and the Irish alternative of reliability options. And if there's time, and I've been given a very generous amount by the organizers, then I'll talk about how we might design the market. So, what we're concerned with in particular is moving away from carbon-intensive generation, and almost all of the alternatives have the characteristic that they're very costly to build, and most of them, with the exception of biomass arguably and CCS, are then very cheap to run. In the case of onshore wind and PV, in many parts of the world they're already cost competitive. We have a rather perverse policy in this country of therefore refusing to give them support, not just in monetary terms, but in the contractual support to reduce their risk. But offshore and nuclear are still, they certainly need arguably some subsidy given the low market prices. That might change if we put a proper carbon price in place, but they still need support in the sense of long-term assurance, because these, as I say, are very capital-intensive investments. If we're talking about the wires and in other industries, the pipes, the capital cost dominates. It always has. They've had very low variable costs, and designing the right way of recovering those fixed costs is a challenge in a decentralized market. And I'll come back to what happens if you do it wrong and how we might do it better. And the problem is becoming more complicated because decentralized generation can produce very peaky loads. It needn't necessarily if it's given the right kinds of signals. Electric vehicles are a very good example where they're potentially able to provide useful services, but heat pumps, you really do need them in the winter, and that's unfortunately in the northern hemisphere where the peak demands occur. All of these have the implication that we're going to require more flexibility in the system, and the characteristic of flexibility is you need the capacity for occasional use, and that means the capacity factor, the load factor decreases, and the ratio of the capital costs to the running costs again changes. So all of these present capital cost recovery problems. Now the impressive thing, I've started saying how much did we add to renewable capacity from 2007. Before that it was mostly hydro, and this is terawatt hours for the whole of the European 27, but in particular I've concentrated on the top 12 member states. And what you can see, unsurprisingly, is this huge growth in support in Germany, followed by the UK, which by 2015 was the second largest contributor. That may surprise you because the prevailing view in Britain is that we've lagged behind. All of the running has been made in places like Spain, Italy and Germany. Well, it's not quite as simple as that. We have accelerated. Part of that is the fall in costs. As the costs fall, so the credibility of policy becomes less of an issue, and policy credibility in this country has been a problem right from the start, and I'll come back to that. Another way of looking at it is what's the share of electricity generated within each country from renewables, and we started, as you can see, right behind the pack. The pack in this case is those countries that have an above average share for the European Union 15, the core European Union countries. But from starting right behind, we've now accelerated and rapidly overtaken quite a few other countries. So that's the renewable story in this country and others. If that's the past, if we look ahead, National Grid publishes its future energy scenarios, and this is one of the more ambitious ones. If we were to meet the 2 degrees targets that we've agreed upon and arguably tried to exceed, then This is going to be the generation that we will need, and you can see the reddish part, the bottom part, purple, is nuclear. The reddish part is coal, and that is moving out of the system and pretty much completely gone by 2025. Gas, the next one up, yellow, has taken over from coal in the period of coal's decline. But the big thing that is supposed to happen, the bluish bit, is the wind. And the little purpley bit above that is solar PV. This country, sometimes it's sunny, not as much as other parts of the world. Now that's generation, so bear that in mind when I shift to what the capacity requirements are. What you will notice, the black line is supposed to be, is the peak demand forecast, and the characteristic of renewables is you need a lot of capacity to deliver the energy. The load factors are much lower. And the thing that's striking is the coal disappears, but the gas, on this scenario, if anything, the capacity requirements get even larger, because although they're not running much, they're the source of flexibility to provide for the onshore and offshore wind, the dark blue and the lighter blue. And you can see there's a lot of solar capacity, that's the very dark blue above it, even though it's not producing very much. The capacity factor of that's maybe 10%. Offshore wind is 35 to 40%, onshore wind 20 to 26%. So depending on the capacity factor, the amount of capacity you need to deliver that energy can vary very substantially. And we can see that this is historic capacity load factors, and you can see black, the coal, the load factor, even though we've been closing stations, has been falling very dramatically in the short run, matched by an increase of capacity factor for gas, but that's on the back of a long-term decline. Nuclear power just fluctuates according to its reliability and availability, but that should be running as much as it can. So that's the story of the capacity, and it's the capacity that costs the money that we need to raise. Right, so that's the evidence. Now what about economic principles to guide this policy design? And the primary point that economists make is you cannot leave things to the market when there are market failures. There are simple-minded folk out there who think that economists are fundamentalists and that the market will always deliver. We have never believed that. And we have been much more interested in where the market works well, there's really not a problem. But the interesting stuff is where the market is not going to work. And in particular, where the actions of agents produce consequences which aren't transacted through markets, like they emit carbon dioxide or air pollutants, then that damage should be reflected in the decision on how much of it you produce. But the market is not giving the right signal and needs to be rectified in some ways. But it's not all bad news. Some of the benefits that actions produce, of which the most important that I'm going to talk about are the research, the development, the demonstration, the learning that comes from doing things for the first time and the second time. Those benefits are very hard to capture by the producers of the equipment that shows how to do it. Those learning externalities are absolutely fundamental for the case for supporting renewables in particular. The next part is that the theory of economics, the most fully articulated theory, is a complete market theory in which you identify every single commodity or service sufficiently precisely that you can define its price. And the proper theory says not only now but at every date in the future, and not only at every date in the future but in every state of the world. So a complete market theory is an unbelievably unrealistic requirement, and you have to then start thinking, in its absence, what are you going to do to replace those missing markets? But in the very specific case of electricity, as I've said, we have to distinguish between a number of characteristics of electricity. It's not just one thing called electrons. The capacity problem of the fixed costs, which is at its most acute in the transmission and distribution network. If you're going to have them under, thank you, private ownership, then the private owners have to be repaid for the value of the network. But the running of the network may be extremely cheap, and the running, the operation is where you want to guide people to make the right decisions on when and where to use the network, and in particular to deal with the problem of scarcity when the capacity is tight. Those price signals will not by themselves recover enough money to pay for the fixed costs. So you then have the obvious problem of where does the rest of the money come from, and you can think of that as a tax on the users of the system. And the issue when you have an economist advising on public finance is you want to minimize the damage that you do in collecting that money, minimize the distortion cost. And that has implications of how you should design the charges. But the other principle that economists are acutely aware of is that it should be fair and equitable, and those two requirements are in tension and need to be balanced off against each other. And I'll come back to showing some of the ways in which that must be done. When we're talking about nuclear power being the extreme example of something that takes a long time to build, is very costly, and will probably run for between 50 and 60 years. So the income stream to pay for that capital comes over a long period of time, and the cost of the capital should be very low in a world in which the reason that we're using low carbon investment is to avoid damaging climate change. And when you're thinking about long-term issues like climate change, there are very powerful arguments that Nick Stern and many others have set out in their analysis of the costs of climate damage that argue for very low interest rates, very low weighted average costs of capital. Now, if you want the private sector to lend at low rates of interest, that means it's going to take a very long time to recover the money they've invested. The good news is the plant lasts a very long time. The bad news is the predictability of government policy and market situations over more than a few years is extremely doubtful. And if you go to a bank and say, lend me at 3% for the next 60 years to invest in something that half the countries on the planet have suddenly woken up and said they don't want, you're not going to get that money. So finding ways of underwriting those investments, if you want to have very long-term durable things with problematic characteristics like carbon capture and storage is another example, onshore wind in this country is another example, even building transmission lines in North Germany is another problem. Financing those in the face of uncertain political support or its absence requires some pretty careful financial engineering to reduce the risk and therefore to reduce the cost of capital. So those are the principles we have to apply, and now let's have a look at the electricity market reform that took place in this country. The problems that the Act was designed to address were, first of all, there was a security of supply issue. Unlike many countries, we were rapidly running out of capacity for a number of reasons. Coal plant has to meet ever more stringent emissions, pollutant of air pollutant emissions in particular, standards, and the cost of transforming a 40-year-old coal-fired plant to meet those is just unacceptable financially, and so they're going to close down. The price of gas during the period running up to this reform was increasing and very volatile, and whereas in the 1990s investing in combined cycle gas turbines was a no-brainer, all of a sudden this looked extremely problematic to finance. So you couldn't refurbish the coal, you were doubtful about the economics of investing in gas, and renewables in this country were very poorly supported, and the evidence that they were meeting their targets was lacking. So there was looking forward in 2016 a serious shortage of capacity, but at the same time nobody was willing to invest. The simple-minded market fundamentalist would have said, oh, but if there's a shortage of capacity, the energy price will go up. You can predict that, so you invest now to clean up when the energy price goes up. In a stable world of completely predictable policy and commercial realities, maybe, but not in this country. As I said, the renewables targets were both expensive and resisted and weren't delivering their targets. The European emissions trading system, which sets the price of carbon, was in a pretty bad state in this period. The prices were collapsing. Its future credibility was extremely problematic. Whether it would last beyond 2020 was unclear. If you are going to invest in a power station that takes, in the nuclear case, 10 years to build, you want to know not what the carbon price is tomorrow, but what it's going to be like in 10, 20, 30, 40 years' time. And it wasn't delivering that. And there were a number of other problems with various policies. So, the trilemma, or the objectives were, we wanted a secure electricity system, that was the primary requirement. It should be sustainable, low carbon, that was our Climate Change Act commitment, and obviously it should be done at least cost or affordably. So the security was going to be addressed by providing a capacity payment in which you asked, how much will it cost me to persuade you to build a power station? You tell me, and then you get a contract to build it. The carbon price problem, the emissions trading allowance being inadequate, was addressed by Her Majesty's Treasury. Once they saw a case for a new tax that was supported, they jumped in ahead of the Act and introduced the carbon price floor. Then there were some problems, and I'll come to those in a minute, so they changed it. And that just shows that tax policy is never a credible long-term signal unless you have ways of making it so. But the crucial thing is to reduce the cost of capital, to reduce the risk of investment. They had long-term contracts, 15-year contracts for renewables to lower the weighted average cost of capital. And they originally thought that the bureaucrats in Whitehall would be able to determine the right price to pay. I was on the panel of technical experts that said this is a really bad idea. And eventually they moved to a system of auctioning, and I'm going to argue that that was one of the big successes of the reform. So here is the evolution of the European carbon price, and it had been falling quite dramatically. At the moment that they set the carbon price floor, and the carbon price floor was supposed to be the line that goes up to £30 in 2020, but going up to £70 a tonne by 2030. That was in large part designed to make sure that by the time nuclear power stations were running, the carbon price would make them commercially justified. They would then be comparable in cost to the least cost fossil plant, gas in particular. And the way the carbon price floor was to be delivered was to add a carbon price support or a carbon price tax onto the emissions allowance price to bring it up to that trajectory. And when it was set, as it was before the budget in 2011, the carbon price was actually not too bad, but it subsequently collapsed. And so the initial carbon price support was very low and not enough to bring it up to that floor. But that said, the government then hoped in setting the carbon price tax. All the European Union countries were in a fiscal mess. Here was a tax that was a tax on something bad as opposed to a tax on something good like goods or labour. What's not to like with a tax on something bad that raises revenue? So we thought, the British government thought, surely other countries, seeing the failures of the carbon price set by the emissions trading allowance, given the financial crisis, given the targets for reducing carbon, surely other countries would follow suit. But they didn't, and at that point the Treasury became very worried that we would become seriously uncompetitive, and they froze the carbon price floor at that level of £18 a tonne. So what's been happening? Well, the blue line at the bottom is the current price in GB pounds of the European Union carbon price. The red line is what happens once you add the carbon price tax, and you can see it's periodically raised at budgets, and it's finally no longer raised in 2014, and then it stays at £18 a tonne. Now, the dotted line is the carbon price floor that was the intention of introducing this carbon price tax, and you can see it took a couple of steps before we got to where it should have been. And the really interesting story is the blue line at the bottom, because after discussing for years and years and years, finally the European Commission agreed to withdraw allowances that were surplus to tighten the market for carbon emissions, and therefore to give a more credible future price. And the effect of that, as you can see, has been an incredible increase in the price. It's gone from £5 to £25 a tonne in a relatively short time. If you had bought allowances at the beginning of last year, you would have made a fortune. It really worked. Now, this is the pleasing thing: prices really work. So at the black at the top, this is the generation pattern quarterly in GB, and you can see coal is very much the winter fuel. That's when we need the extra capacity. Gas is the yellow in the middle, blue at the bottom is the nuclear, and then we have wind and solar coming in as a result of reduced costs and eventually a better system of support. The other notable thing is the peak demand is gradually decreasing. So efficiency improvements in electricity consumption, particularly on lighting, LEDs, have reduced the demand. So the combination of increased renewables, reduced demand, and the carbon price suddenly making coal most expensive fuel to run relative to gas, which used to be the most expensive, has been a dramatic squeeze in the share of coal. So a few years ago it was about 40% of total demand. Last year it was 7%. Last time I was in here in January on a sunny day, I looked to see what the real-time generation is, which you can look if you want to at any moment, and I found that we were producing 3 times as much electricity from sunshine as from coal. So the carbon price has really shifted coal out of the system. That's the carbon price story. Now, the other externality, that was the carbon externality, which is addressed by a carbon tax. The other externality, the beneficial one, is the learning benefits of increasing the deployment of renewables. And just to jump ahead immediately, these are double log scales. You may be familiar with them. They're learning curves. They show on the left solar PV, and that's a factor of 100. So the early solar PV was seriously expensive. The cumulative capacity along the bottom, again, it's doubling or going up by a factor of 10 each step. And the green line is so-called Swanson's law, that says, rather like Moore's law, every time you double the installed capacity, the costs per unit fall by 20%. And if anything, we seem to be exceeding that. But the amazing thing is, this seems to have been true like Moore's law for 4 decades. So those learning externalities are really significant. And unfortunately, the cost of doubling capacity when you have 1 megawatt installed is, even though it's expensive per unit, doesn't cost much. When you've got 1,000 or 100,000 megawatts, cost of doubling it then does become really significant. Wind, the story is similar, not such a dramatic learning rate, and there's a lot of stuff going on because the height matters. The wind strength goes up with height. but so does the cost at the cube, I think, of the height. So there are various other things that are going on, and offshore and onshore confuse it. But the story is the same in that there is some learning. But to go back, so what does this imply? You want to encourage people to install more capacity to drive down future costs. The larger the range over which you can persuade people to do that, the more benefit you get. So there's a case for a global support system if you can only get it. Otherwise, you want the largest collective, if you like, club of people willing to support this for the future benefits. So the European Union is better than a single country, but there is a proposal which has now been launched called Mission Innovation. I think it used to be called the Apollo Project. It now has 22 countries that have committed to collectively increasing their support for research and development and deployment. If you then ask, well, the crucial thing is actually delivering the equipment, the panels or the wind turbines, and installing them at the site, their subsequent operation, assuming they work, is not going to deliver much more learning. It's the actual production and installation that matters. So where is the least cost place to do that? Well, it's where the resource is strongest, because that means they get the most money from running, and you need the least money to support the investment. So a global argument would say we would strongly support installing PV in places where it's really sunny, otherwise known as the developing world, and the wind in suitable places as well. But it's the installation that needs the support, not the running. In addition to that, they displace carbon. Now, if you properly price carbon, that will be accounted for. If you don't properly price carbon, then you need an additional benefit subsidy to pay for the carbon that's displaced. And you can do a quick sum. So if you think the shortfall is £20 a tonne of carbon and it's displacing gas, then there's a £9 extra subsidy for the output of a zero carbon technology. Well, I've shown you this graph. What I do want to do is say, what is that worth? It's all very well to say there is an externality. A policymaker would say, how much? What is it worth actually paying? So I've written a paper that tries to calculate this on a relatively simple model, which could probably be improved. It's sufficiently complicated that it takes quite a lot of algebra to get to the numbers. But what this diagram shows, along the top is the gigawatts of peak capacity, which is a measure of the amount of capacity you've installed cumulatively since 2010, or well, since before then, but there's not much in 2010. So you can see China, for instance, starting with hardly any at all, whereas Germany had a huge amount in 2010. China has expanded to become, by 2015, the largest installer of PV in the world, and has now, or had then, 44 gigawatts out of a global total of 234. So you can look at the shares of cumulative up to 2015 of different countries. And then you can say, and this is, let's see, the appropriate benefit that they're generating, which is the spillover per kilowatt of peak capacity. Let's see if I can point to this. I don't know if it works, but anyway, about halfway down the table there's a thing called the spillover per kilowatt capacity. And you see it starts off quite high at $822. It's falling as we reap the benefits. So by 2015 it's $472 per peak capacity. The peak capacity then costs just over $1,000. So it's about a 40% subsidy justified in terms of the future lowering of costs that installation should produce if the world carries on as it has for the last 40 years. And then you can take those numbers and say, well, how much subsidy effectively has the policy in these different countries produced? So you can see that cumulatively Germany has contributed about 29, and this is only up to 2015, $29 billion of benefit to the rest of the world. And if you add them all up, you get something like $110 billion of benefit. That is a large number. That justifies a lot of subsidy, and that is at the heart of it the case for things like mission innovation and the subsidy regime. When people say supporting renewables is very expensive, yes, but the benefits are very large. Okay, so how did we support renewables? In the past we gave a variable subsidy per kilowatt hour added on to the electricity price, and then we decided to fix the price in a contract for difference so that you could go to the bank and say, here's my revenue stream, it's guaranteed. Now on the left hand side you've got the various technologies and the administered price that was set by the civil servants going down to the city and saying, how much would you like to support these technologies? And they said, oh, terribly expensive, we need a large amount of money to support them. So the civil servant says, yes, yes, of course, and published those prices, and indeed offered some to the public. And a lot of people rushed in and said that those prices were really, really keen to build. And then they realized that it would be better to have an auction. And you can see that just to take the case of onshore winds, they wanted to provide, £95, and the auction cleared at £80. The solar PV, somebody hadn't read Auction Theory 101 and thought that somebody else would put a very high bid in, but they discovered that their low bid actually cleared the market at £50, so they immediately withdrew and got the same price as the wind of £80. So that was pretty impressive, and the amount of money saved, I calculated, was equivalent to a reduction in the cost of capital of 3% real. And to put that in perspective, if we're spending, as the plan was, something like £80 billion over the period to support renewables, a 3% reduction in the cost translates into about £2.5 billion a year for 15 years for the life of the contract. So the auction, compared to setting an administered price, saved a huge amount of money. What was even more dramatic was when we had auctions for offshore wind. The original prices that were published, and at which people said it's going to be very difficult to meet those costs, of £150. Then they ran one auction and it came in at £120. And then they ran another auction, and looking ahead to delivery in 2022, prices come down to about £60 or a bit less. So it's a halving of the cost of this enormously capital intensive investment just over the space of a few years, and it's a combination of a number of things. Part of it is the auction revealing who is actually best placed to deliver at the least cost, and secondly it's the credibility of offering a long-term contract that allows the supply chain to be built up to deliver these things at scale and therefore at much lower cost. And the same thing is happening in Europe. These costs are higher than you may see quoted because these costs include the costs of delivering the power from offshore to the grid, whereas in some other cases the grid company pays for that, and all you do is look at the price of the offshore platform. So you have to be careful comparing across countries. But these are comparable to prices that are now being delivered elsewhere. And these, just again to put it in perspective, the Hinkley Point nuclear power plant was given a price of £92. So at £60 we're 2/3 of the cost of that nuclear power station, but that nuclear power station was built at a very high cost of capital. At a lower cost of capital it will be comparable to offshore wind, but the point is comparable. Right, so how are we going to support? What's the best way? At the moment, just to remind you, we pay per kilowatt hour at these strike prices or at the auction prices for 15 years. Well, that's the wrong way to do it, because what we want to do is to concentrate on actually delivering the investment, not delivering the output. So here's a mechanism that would do it. You have an auction and you say, tell me, I'm going to pay you the amount you quote for the first, say, 30,000 full operating hours, or 30,000 megawatt hours per megawatt of installed capacity. And you tell me how much you need over that period of time. Then you can use that to go to the bank and get the loan to build the plant. And the reason is that that then is a fixed subsidy. So when you get it, depending on how good the resource is, you may get it slightly more quickly or slightly more slowly, but the amount you're going to get is independent of where you put it. Whereas if you pay per megawatt hour for 15 years, where you put it really matters. And the high resource area is then over-compensated. This fits in nicely with the fourth electricity package or fourth energy package of the European Union, because it constitutes investment aid, which is what they are keen. It has the big advantage that you can then use the energy price to give the right signals about where and when. The when doesn't matter much because that's when the wind blows, but the where does matter. So you can use locational prices to give better signals of where you should locate, to avoid saturating certain areas which just happen to have high wind but not very much transmission capacity, otherwise known as Scotland and North Germany. And it in particular doesn't over-reward those Scottish landowners who happen to have places where they can build wind turbines and clean up big time. Let me illustrate that a bit better in the following diagram, if I can get there. We seem to have frozen. I don't know if there are clever people in the room who know how to unfreeze things like this. Desperate measures would be to... Yes, here we are, we're in. Okay, so I'm going to illustrate, this is with locational marginal pricing and spot pricing for wind, and I have Scotland up in the north and East Anglia where we are, and the wind in the north is stronger than in the south, so it would give you 2,500 full operating hours a year. And the nodal price there is £35, and down in the east is £49. If you pay per megawatt hour, the renewable obligation certificate pays you £50, then the extra wind in the north makes it commercially better to locate there, but actually the place where it's least cost to deliver the power is in the east, and we've distorted that choice by paying per output rather than paying for installation. So that's the argument for changing the system of support. Now, I can run through this pretty quickly because I'm sure you're pretty familiar with it. The electricity capacity is that will determine how much you can produce. The energy will then be produced and delivered. Where it's produced will depend upon the losses on the transmission system. How much it costs depend on what fuel is used and what the carbon price is, and then the quality I'm going to spend less time on. Networks again have the capacity problem, and if you think about it, what you're paying for when you buy access to a network is exactly that, access to be able to take a certain amount when you need it, and then the cost of using it is relatively small, and the quality of service typically gets bundled in. So the energy cost is fairly straightforward. The most efficient way is to provide it at the system marginal cost, and that is the most expensive generator that's in merit. Its value depends on where it's being delivered. Now the capacity is the value of meeting demand, and that's going to be the loss of load probability times the value of lost load minus the system marginal cost. Or putting it another way, we've got the value of lost load is what it's worth to the consumer or rather the cost to them of not having it, and that occurs with a loss of load probability, but the rest of the time, 1 minus the loss of load probability, you get the energy. So when you rearrange that, you can divide up the price of electricity as an energy price and a capacity payment. And that is the argument for having a capacity auction. I'll skip over how the prices have evolved depending on the fuel costs, and also point out, or just to remind you, that the reason that we felt the need for a capacity mechanism was the failure of the market to deliver the required capacity and the impending shortage of capacity. Lots of countries say, no need to pay for capacity, we've got plenty of it. That's fine if you've got plenty, not if you're about to run out. And as I pointed out, increasingly the load factors of the plant that's going to be built are going to be low and therefore more difficult to predict and therefore more difficult to finance because the revenue streams are much less predictable. So we ran a capacity auction. Here's the first capacity auction. The predicted cost of, or net cost of new entry after allowing for all the revenue that you can sell from building a plant was £49. We'll hear from Chris Dent and Stan and people like that exactly what that number, where that number comes from and what its relationship is to everything else. But the auction cleared at 40% of that, at £20. The subsequent auctions, this is a complicated diagram. The red bars which you read on the right hand side are the prices at which the auctions cleared. The first auction cleared at a low price relative to the cost of new gas turbines, but a very optimistic builder or potential builder of new gas turbines nevertheless offered to build 1,600 megawatts of these plants, and then went to the bank and said, well, we're going to get £20 instead of £50, and the bank said go away, and hence that contract failed, and there needed to be another auction shortly afterwards to make up for the missing amount. Now fortunately, or unfortunately, the original auction design ignored the potential security of supply offered by imports or interconnectors into the country, and we said, that's silly, you've already done a lot of work arguing the case for more interconnection on the grounds of improved security of supply. And the European Union picked up on that and said, you've got to include interconnectors. The interconnectors they'd ignored were about the same as the failed combined cycle gas turbine that didn't get a contract. So we got away scot-free by having the interconnectors there to meet the shortfall. And in the subsequent auctions, we've had interconnectors successfully getting auctions, and the most interesting and surprising thing is, so did storage. The original storage was derated in the same way as an 8-hour pumped storage scheme in the mountains of Wales, and people then pointed out, but the batteries you're building only run for half an hour at that rated capacity, and maybe that's not quite what you had in mind. So there's been big issue, again we'll hear from Chris Dent, how you derate a battery. It's not the same as a pumped storage scheme. So we're gradually learning how to manage an auction and which things to put in and how much of them to include. But the story is one in which the prices have been coming down, and everything seemed to be going splendidly until the European Union said they're illegal. So we now don't have a capacity auction. I just want to quickly point out there are other ways of delivering the capacity, and the island of Ireland, which has a single electricity market of the Northern Ireland in the UK and the Republic in the EU and going on in the EU, have designed a reliability option. And so what that does is the regulator sets the strike price at the price which is somewhat above the most expensive variable cost of operating on the system, which probably in Ireland is a distillate fueled reciprocating engine or open cycle gas turbine running on diesel. And then the market is allowed to clear at whatever is the scarcity price up to the value of lost load, except at the moment it's capped and it will gradually increase to that. And just to make sure that the price is at least the scarcity price, the system operator will support the price when things get tight. And the reason for that is the most important thing for the small island of Ireland is trade with the rest of the world, namely Britain, and they want trade to take place at what it's worth. So it's very important that if the Irish think that the British are willing to pay way more than the scarcity price in Ireland, they should export. But if things are tight in Ireland and it's really tight, they should be willing to import, and that will be signalled by the price trading between countries. The price inside the country will be capped at the strike price, so the consumers have been insured against high prices when electricity is scarce. The generators, in return for giving up those high prices, which are hard to predict, very volatile, difficult to bank, will get a guaranteed price for their ability to supply at this capped and relatively low strike price. So you run an auction to say how much would you need to be paid to give up the rights to those high prices and to assure yourselves that you can build the plant that's needed on the system. And that auction has worked so far reasonably well. So it's a better system, I would argue, than the British one because it doesn't distort the market signals of scarcity. It has the advantage that if you're willing to be exposed to the market prices, you don't need to bid for a capacity or a reliability option. So that part works pretty well. The Irish too, since they're aiming at 75% non-synchronous penetration, in other words, wind turbines and PV doesn't provide any inertia on the system, and therefore the frequency sensitivity becomes very high and would change very rapidly if there was a fluctuation in demand or supply. They now have developed a whole new set of services to meet that, and synthetic inertia is one of those. Very fast response, and you can see the time scales at the bottom of the graph. You need to be able to find power in the frame 1 to 5 seconds, and then you gradually replace it with things that take longer to come onto the system. So there's a debate which we may hear more about whether it's better to pay by the second or whether to define products which can only be delivered in various time frames, but that you need them is becoming recognised in Ireland, and they're now running at 60% non-synchronous penetration, 65% I think recently, and managing the system at that. Okay, so let's now ask, well, what went wrong? What went right with the electricity market reform was the capacity auction and the carbon price and the renewable support system up to a point. What didn't work well was the way which they charge generators for connecting to the network. So if you connect to the high tension grid, you pay a generation transmission network use of system charge, which varies across the country up to about £25 a kilowatt per year in the north, which is to compare with the £20 per kilowatt that they got in the capacity auction. So if you're in the north, you're essentially paying all that money out to connect to the high tension grid. But if you connect to the lower tension distribution network, the theory was, well, you avoid using the high tension grid, so you are credited with that avoided generation charge, and you receive and you avoid the load placed on it, and the load transmission network use of system charge is actually very high, and the consequence of that is you get £50 a kilowatt per year more if you connect to the lower voltage than if you connect to the higher voltage, pretty much regardless of where you are. In fact, there's a graph probably at the end in the appendix which shows, although the charges vary across the country, the difference between the two doesn't. So what happened? Well, the poor old gas turbine, which didn't get funding because it only got £20 a kilowatt to connect to the high tension grid, was moved out by a lot of very small 10 megawatt reciprocating diesel generators connected to the low tension grid. And though they're more expensive, because they got £50 credit, that's where they connected. So the message is that getting these transmission network charges right is the sort of complicated thing that regulators spend years and years thinking about and then get it wrong. And you run an auction one afternoon and the outcome is responding to those prices. So the speed with which regulators now have to think through the perverse consequences that their charges may deliver has accelerated. And this is what we're talking about, is the transmission residual, the amount of money that you need to collect over and above the charges that are efficient charges for the network. Used to be very low because essentially we flogged off the network for next to nothing, and we didn't have much money to recover. It had been built in the 60s and 70s and 80s before we sold it, and it was sold for way less than the cost of rebuilding it. But we have been doing a lot of building recently to bring the wind down from the north, and you can see that the gap between the two, the distortion tax element, has been rising. And finally, after 3 years thinking about it, the regulator says, okay, you won't get this benefit if you connect a generator to the distribution network. So that,
David?
yes.
We're supposed to be ending at 1:15.
Right. Let me quickly jump through. I'll just say there is a very well-developed theory of how you collect the tax element, and the answer is, and it was developed by the head of Électricité de France in the 30s, Boiteau, who realized that you needed to collect a large amount of money for nuclear power and for the transmission network, said, well, the theory is you want to minimize the distortion, which is to minimize the percentage reduction in demand that your charges will levy. And if you levy them on access, probably the access is very insensitive to the price and you wouldn't reduce your access demand much. Whereas if you levy it on energy, you might install all sorts of clever devices and reduce your demand quite a lot. And that would be a very inefficient way of doing it. So the implication is you try and levy the charges on access. And it means that the regulator's task is now to think through the implications of how that works. And the obvious thing is you charge for access. But of course that means that most people probably take a fairly similar peak demand for their kettles and everything else. So the poor are going to be paying a comparably large cost to the rich, and that may not be fair. So one way you can do that is to say, you have a choice. You can pay a high energy price until you have produced enough surplus from that to cover the fixed costs. So this is one possible tariff schedule, and that is a device that's used in other markets where there is a fairly well-defined fixed cost and very low running costs. So I will probably skip over most of this in the interests of giving you time to ask some difficult questions. I would just point out that the costs of raising funds in the public sector are now at an all-time low. The requirements to meet the climate change challenge have never been higher. That's a happy match of ability to finance combined with a demand for finance of investment. Investment is a much better solution to macroeconomic problems than printing money and allowing property prices in London to reflect that surplus. And so dealing with that makes sense. And I'll skip over, but the slides will be available. What market designs might come out, but I've more or less indicated the kinds of things that would make sense. And I will jump to the conclusions. The main messages are the way we support renewables is not particularly well designed, because we justifiably want to provide benefits to pay for the learning, but that is on the investment, not on the running of the plant, which distorts where they're put. We want, and the capacity auction is not only giving entry signals, but exit signals, it's telling which plants to close down. That implies that the transmission element should be a long-term contract, so that when you're deciding whether to exit, it isn't just to avoid the tax element of recovering the costs of the network. Again, that's a distortion I haven't had much time to dwell on, but it's potentially quite important. And the regulator is beginning to avoid the distortion between which level of voltage you connect your capacity to. The tariff structure is not very well designed for all of the decentralized generation, PV, electric vehicles, the rest of it. But the principles of how to do it I think are very clear. So economists do have something to say on mechanism design. They have some comments to make on the policies which we have seen working out and what perverse effects they can have. And now it's over to you to refine and design the ways of measuring capacity and designing the decentralized tariff structure, bearing in mind not only efficiency, which is the sort of thing that optimizers are good at, but the equity aspects of how it's going to be paid for and who it's going to pay for. So I will now face my challenger.
Professor Daniel Ralph of the Judge Business School will present a short question, and we will retire for morning tea at 10 up. So Danny.
I'll keep this very brief. Of course, I prepared 25 minutes with slides, and I'm bitterly disappointed not to be able to send
And
that.
so am I.
A bit more seriously. So David has given us a kind of masterclass on the interface between policy, which you could say is about answering the question, what's the right thing to do, and economics, which, although it doesn't avoid that question, perhaps in this context we could say is how to do it right. And doing the right thing in this case will be reducing carbon production in the face of global warming. And David's come through several different layers, which shows the complexity. It's almost fractal of how to implement schemes that actually deliver that. And it's not free of policy, because the policymakers have actually got to decide which kind of regulation to implement for reasons of efficiency and fairness. And the key thing that David said early on twice was carbon is an externality, and so a market's not going to solve that. On the other hand, solving that problem with renewables brings you to another externality, which is the externality of learning, which is a positive externality. And again, the market won't be able to take advantage of that, so you need to give it structure in which you take advantage of the second externality. So far, so good. The role of learning is particularly important in this case because we have high capital intensive, very low running cost, and very long-term uncertainty. So we're going to be faced with all of those things throughout the week, I'm sure. The role of location I'll come back to in a minute. So David said a little bit about that, and Britain has its own kind of location problem. Some is to do with connection charges, some is to do with not having fully recognised locational marginal prices. And so David said a few words about that. And then he apparently switched to something called capacity. And the switch to capacity was just to recognise the fact that if we're struggling to closing coal plants and we're struggling to fund wind plants, are we going to run out of power? And I'm not going to say anything more about that, other than to say that for a non-economist, there's a bewildering amount of detail. And there are often schemes which purport to deliver something similar, but one is based on a subsidy to the quantity of capacity, and another might be related to the way you pay for it, and is that the quantity of consumption? And these things do matter, but I rapidly get out of my depth, and no doubt that's what a lot of the discussion is going to be about when you talk about mechanisms. Okay, reliability options and so on. Now, the last thing I wanted to say was David kind of didn't really address too much about the international situation, although you mentioned Ireland and interconnectors. So if you look at, I think on one of your conclusion slides you mentioned subsidiarity, which is what's the role of the EU in all this? Well, the EU also has problems. It doesn't have locational pricing, for example. We don't really know how the interconnectors would be used at times of crisis. So those rules are not, let's say, fully transparent. And so each individual nation, therefore, has to make the best of it, making some guesses about what will and won't be stable at the European level. So that's an issue that I think we will probably continue to discuss. And the last thing that it's actually up, I think it's perhaps not invisible on this slide, but demand-side response affects all of these things. In some obvious ways and some kind of very invidious and difficult to handle ways. So some of these, the point of me going through this is to say that, to thank David really for setting the scene. It was a very rich talk. I've come away somewhat enlightened and somewhat confused, but that's just me. But it just shows the complexity of the subject. I don't have any particular question because there are so many. But perhaps that's all I'll say, and to thank David for setting the scene for us for this week of the conference.
Okay. Okay. Thank you, Danny. Thank you, David. So, in the rest of the day, we'll have opportunities for questions. I think the question period, though, we'll be taking informally. Where are the biscuits and coffee? Just outside. So the questions we'll be taking informally rather formally at this time. Please reassemble at 1/4 if I'm correct, for Natalia's talk. So at this point, we'll adjourn temporarily. Thank you.